This is the third part in our three-part series on handwriting, spelling, and language. And today we're going to take a step back and look at what language really consists of and see if we all are defining it the same way. So what is language? Language is really a shared code of arbitrary symbols that are governed by certain rules about how they are to be combined. So something that often kind of blows students' minds when they first start talking about teaching the alphabet is that the alphabet actually doesn't have any purpose behind its order. There's no reason that A comes before B and B comes before C. That is arbitrary. The symbols don't have meaning. The way that we put them together and the rules we give them is what gives them meaning. So speech is obviously how we speak these symbols, and then this becomes important to you as a teacher because a lot of the students that you work with may have language difficulties. Some students who struggle with language may have a language impairment, which would be a language delay, and others might have a language disorder, which would be used with students who have difficulty learning the language, even though they don't have intellectual, sensory, or emotional difficulties. So speech is the way we articulate, it's the voice we use, it's the fluency with which we communicate. Language are the symbolic systemic rules. So what words mean, vocabulary would be a part of language. How to make new words, so spelling, handwriting, the stuff we've been talking about. How to put words together is language, and what word combinations are best in what situation. So that would be the semantics. A language disorder is the impairment or deviant development of comprehension and or use of a spoken, written, and or other symbol system. This disorder might involve the form of language, so that would be the phonological, morphological, or syntactic system. So students may have difficulty with learning what letters represent what sounds. That would be a phonological difficulty. Then there are students who have a content of language disorder, and that's the semantic system. So that would be putting words into proper sentences to form thoughts, or to express thoughts rather. And then the function of language is the pragmatic system. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. So I think most of you are somewhat familiar with phonology, morphology, and syntax, since we've spent some time talking about those this semester. Semantics, that's really the word meanings. So some students will have trouble with the actual content of a sentence or of vocabulary. Pragmatics is the one students tend to have the biggest difficulty understanding, students being college students, future teachers. So I'm going to give you an example that I find really useful when talking about pragmatics. So let's take the word stripe. On a tiger, you have a stripe, okay? That is, if you are listening to me say that, you can picture in your head the tiger and the stripe that's on the tiger's coat. In context, we know that the word stripe means the line on a tiger's coat. But if we say line instead of stripe, that is a function issue. That's a pragmatics issue. So you understand the vocabulary word, so you understand the semantics, but the way that it functions in context is pragmatics. So I'm going to say that again. If you say the tiger has lines on his coat, that is a pragmatic misunderstanding. Semantics is correct. Technically, it is a line, but pragmatically, the function of it is incorrect. So let's go back and talk again about what phonology, morphology, and syntax are. So phonology is the sound system of the language. So when we work with young children and we have them give us the beginning letter sound. So A is for apple, B is for ball. That's phonology. Ba, ba, that type of thing. Morphology is the rule system that governs the structure of the words and how words are constructed. So if you, way back when we first started, we talked about phonemes and morphemes. Morphemes are when you put phonemes together to make different sounds, and it's just the basic element of meaning. So when we talk about root words and prefixes and suffixes, those are all basic elements of meaning. You know, when you say, read something that says re at the beginning, redo, revise, it means to do again. That re is the basic element of meaning. Syntax, this is when you combine words into a sentence and the relationships among the different words make sense and you're able to gather meaning from the sentence. I know some of you are working with students right now who are having trouble with syntax in their writing. The sentences, when they write them, don't make sense. Each word makes sense on its own, but the syntax, the structure of the sentence, does not. And then, as we mentioned, semantics is meanings of words, and pragmatics is how those meanings are then applied using the rules of language. And I just thought this was a helpful visual to help you see kind of how things are all connected. So we start with phonics or phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, all of those. It's like the smaller components that build into the bigger ones, and then the kind of definition is on the bottom part. So phonetics is speech sounds, phonology is phonemes, morphology is words. So remember those small units of meaning. Syntax is phrases and sentences. Semantics is then the literal meaning of the phrases and sentences, and pragmatics is the meaning in context. Another way to think about pragmatics too is it's often applied to figurative language. So when we say it's raining cats and dogs, semantically we know what that means. There are literal cats and dogs falling from the sky, but pragmatically we know that it means that it's raining very hard. I'm not going to talk through this whole chart, but I wanted to share it with you because I think it's really helpful for understanding what these different topics are and how they're incorporated or misused by students in all four domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So I want to go down to syntax because I think that one's really helpful. So I'm just going to talk through it. So in listening, syntax is understanding sentence structure. So when we're listening to a sentence, you're listening to someone speak and they say, "It was a beautiful day outside. The sky was really blue and the grass is really green and I just love the sky blue." You as a listener know that that's supposed to say, "I just love the blue sky." That's listening for syntax. And inherently, when you learn a language, really you learn the syntactic rules along with it. And we don't really spend time in school learning that an adjective generally comes before a noun. But you learn really quickly that that just doesn't sound right. So that's what syntax is. It's this sentence structure. When we're speaking, you can also hear when syntactically something is incorrect. There are rules associated with this, but you just don't tend to learn them in school. You'll notice students who have learning difficulties related to these maybe use those words incorrectly, particularly in their writing. They may not know, they may not recognize the connection between how adjectives work in a sentence when you're speaking and how they're supposed to work in a sentence when you're writing. We know that they're the same. It's the same rule, but not all students will be able to recognize that. The other one I want to talk about again is pragmatics because that can be a little bit more difficult. And I think this chart really helps lay it out well. So in listening, pragmatics is understanding kind of the social aspects of spoken language. A lot of students who have disabilities related to understanding figurative language, this will come up quite a bit. When you use a figurative statement or you use hyperbole, like I'm starving, a student who has difficulty with pragmatics might come back to you and say, you're not starving. Well, that's not understanding the social aspects of listening and speaking in pragmatics. And then when a student has difficulty with pragmatics and speaking, they may not convey their message well, or they may overemphasize something that should be underemphasized. It's very nuanced for us as people who do not have difficulties with these things often, but for students, especially young students who have not yet learned how to operate with figurative language, this can be really difficult. For reading and writing, it's about point of view. So when reading, understanding the point of view of the writer, who the audience might be, that kind of thing. And then when writing, understanding how to convey a point of view and an intended message. Some ways to identify that students may have language difficulties would be they might be unable to follow simple directions at school. They may not even recognize what the teacher is trying to get them to do. Like if the teacher says, please stand in line, and the student doesn't understand that, that could be a clue. Also, they may have immature sounding speech, kind of like baby talk, or they may sound like a much younger child. Another way you might identify language difficulties is if students are not particularly clear or able to be precise when they're trying to name something. So they might say, oh, that thing over there, or have a difficult time finding a word. They also might substitute sounds, and we hear this a lot with spaghetti. They'll say biscotti instead of spaghetti. And just a lack of precision can be an indication. They also might be unable to make one-to-one correspondence between letters and sounds. So like I was saying earlier, they may not get that A is for apple, that ah sound. They might not be able to discriminate between sounds well, or they may spend a lot of time independently and not spend as much time with their peers. This linked video is a summary of what we've talked about, but it's also has a lot of great information from a speech and language pathologist. So I think it would be really helpful for you to watch and just kind of learn a little bit more about what to look out for if you think you might have students with speech or language difficulties. Students with language difficulties may have attention deficits. They also might need additional time to understand things and to formulate their ideas. And they might become frustrated more visibly and more quickly than other students. With elementary students, this will manifest with sound difficulties, often difficulty segmenting words, so identifying syllables. They also may not understand abstract concepts, and this can come up not just in language, but in math as well. So understanding relationships among numbers, objects, they might not understand before and after, so that could show up in narrative structure of a story. They might not be able to tell you the order that the story goes in. They also may have trouble with verbal presentation because there's less manipulation of objects and more listening to the teacher, and that can have serious consequences for students who have language difficulties, and they may fall behind. By fourth grade, most content is in print, and students with language problems will begin having particular difficulty. So their deficits will also manifest in text comprehension because there aren't as many visuals to help them understand the text. Students with language difficulties may also see consequences in their social skills. They may revert back to some behaviors that they had when they were younger, and they may misinterpret social cues, fail to think of what others might be feeling, and they may be unable to predict the consequences of their behavior. And this can become much more obvious as they get older and are expected to be more autonomous. It's also important to note that students may be misdiagnosed as having language impairments when they are bilingual or bilingual emergent. So keep that in mind, that you want to take the results of standardized tests with a grain of salt, because some of your students may just be bilingual, and they may not have language impairments. I also want to note that when bilingual students have language disorders, they may need interventions that are different from students who are native English speakers. So for those specific students, they may need a teacher who is bilingual in their native language and in English. They may need a different assessment that isn't as biased, and they also may need instructional strategies that promote both academics and social relevance of the instruction. So you'll want to incorporate things into the curriculum that are relevant to the student culturally as well as academically. So to determine if the student is having difficulty because of a disability, a language difficulty, or lack of exposure to instruction, there are a couple of things that you can do. First, determine how long they've been in the US. If they've only been here 2 years, probably or likely things are related to their status as a bilingual emergent student. You also have to look at attendance and their instructional history. If a student came in say 4th grade, they may have missed phonics instruction in English. That's really key to students learning language and spelling and that kind of thing. So you want to look and see when they came to the US, what type of instruction was happening when they came, and then also how their attendance patterns were. Just as a side note, when I taught in Vegas, I had a lot of first-generation students who were immigrants that had come, late in elementary school. And when they got to me in 7th grade, they had a lot of difficulty with writing and speaking. And that's because they came in late elementary school. So even as a 7th grade teacher, I was having to incorporate some phonics instruction into my classroom. And that's not something that I was prepared for in my teacher preparation, but it's something to know. You also want to look at their cultural background and see if things that we're expecting as teachers are things that are expected in their culture. So are students not understanding figurative language because they don't have it in their language, or they don't have the same type of figurative language in their native language? You also want to look in and compare them to their peers who are also bilingual from similar cultures. Is this typical? Also look at their home life and their developmental history, because those factors can also contribute. If a student is only speaking English at school and only speaking Spanish at home, that may slow down their learning vocabulary, and would probably be typical and may not be an indication of a learning disability. There are 5 major reasons to assess for language skills: to identify potential language problems, to determine their developmental level, to plan your objectives and design appropriate interventions, just like you've been doing with the CBM, to monitor student progress, and to evaluate the language intervention program. There are a couple of ways to do this. You could pull them out for therapy. You can use classroom-based language models like team teaching, self-contained teaching, one-to-one intervention, program development and consultation, and then you can also use a strategies-based model. There are lots of language activities you can use. I've listed some here. A couple of the ones I really like, particularly for language development and vocabulary development, are things like associations. So if you give the students one word like trash, then they can pick all the words they know associated with it, like trash can or garbage or recycling. And that's a really great way to build vocabulary. And then you can also identify when students are having a difficult time coming up with those words, and that may give you an indication that they're having some difficulty or may have a learning delay. Some more listed here. I love teaching phrases, clauses, and adjectives. I think that can be really fun. So even having students learn songs, that can help them identify things. So like you could have them learn, there's a song for all the prepositional or the prepositions that can start a prepositional phrase, or all of the helping verbs, that kind of thing. I also love to teach paraphrasing. So you give students a favorite quote and then ask them to put it in their own words. That can be a really great way to develop language. There are also lots of games that you can play with students related to language, and they also find them very fun. I don't know if you ever played apples to apples when you were in school, but that was one of my favorite things to do in class. I just learned to love words that way, and so the more you can engage students in fun activities related to language, the better.